I've obviously been in the association space for a long time, as Ed kind of alluded there, and for the past 20 years, I have served in a CEO capacity. And you know, when you think about nonprofits, associations, charitable groups, whatever the case is, the one thing that distinguishes those organizations from any other business entity out there is the fact that we have boards. And we're all organizations out trying to make money, whether you're a small business on Main Street or a Fortune 500 company on Wall Street. All businesses out there are trying to hopefully make money, but at the end of the day, the one thing that sets those 501c organizations apart is that they have boards of directors, and those boards are volunteer members. And the reason they have that title nonprofit is that, at the end of the day, they're not supposed to bring home a profit themselves. They're not supposed to be, entitled to anything. They're just doing it because it's the good of their heart. And so, they're there to serve. They're supposed to serve from a servant space. And so, there's just so many things that go into that when you think about board service, and just in general when you talk about the governance that goes into running a nonprofit organization, whether it's a C3, C6, C4, whatever the case that may be. So um, as I started thinking about my 20 plus years involved in nonprofits, and I really think about I had a recent experience with the Wake Forest Area Chamber of Commerce and had some serious governance issues. And, as I started thinking about what to do next in my career, the idea of creating a consulting company really struck home in the sense that, when you think about organizations and when you think about the friction that happens within them, most of the time, it has something to do with their boards. Usually, when there are challenges within an organization, I would say probably 9 times out of 10, it can come back to something to do with their governors in the organization. Whether it's a committee problem, whether it's a leadership pipeline problem, whether it's the board and the CEO partnership, whatever it is, most of the time it's coming down to something to do with the governance of the organization. Something's wrong. And so, when you're experiencing friction in the organization, it's time to figure out, well, what is it? What's wrong with that house of governance? What's going on? Where are in those rooms of that house? Where are the walls shaky? So again, I've developed this what I'm calling this house of governance, and in this house there are 7 rooms, and ideally, the foundation's solid, the walls are solid, the roof is solid, and everything works well. And so again, we're going to kind of walk through those today and sort of talk about sort of in those each of those rooms, sort of what it looks like when they're going well, and sort of what it looks like when things aren't going so well. And then Ed and I are going to have a chance to have a little bit of a dialogue and kind of talk about maybe some of our own personal experiences about, things, when they have gone well for us, in our own governance experiences, and, maybe even some war stories about what it's been like when things haven't gone so well. So, like I said, we'll kind of get through this and we'll talk through, see if I can get my clicker to work here. Um, there we go. So again, we've gone through the introduction and we're going to kind of review sort of the governance and then we'll wrap up here. So the first domain, is around governance, purpose, and strategic focus. So, it's really getting to that notion of, why does the board exist? And is it governing at the right altitude? We hear this notion of, is a board truly living its strategic purpose? Is it truly flying at that 36,000-foot level? Does it understand that its real role is about strategy and vision and mission, and not necessarily getting into the weeds of, how many times have you sat in board meetings when, you're starting to talk about, picking out the colors for the curtains or the napkins at the annual banquet, or somebody's talking about wanting to review the work of your director of communications or whatever the case is. But anytime you have a situation where the board is starting to stray from its purpose and its strategic focus, then you're starting to have a challenge. And so that's why domain one really starts really gearing into that notion of governance, purpose, and strategic focus. Because again, the board has a reason for existing, and it really needs to stay in that lane of understanding why it exists, the purpose, its strategy. It's there to set the course. It's the captain of the ship. I mean, not the captain of the ship necessarily, but it's the navigator. It's the one telling the CEO, okay, this is us as our vision. This is where we want to go. Here's our strategic plan. We're going to give you the resources to put you in that place. And so the question then becomes, as the CEO, as you're sitting there trying to navigate these waters as the captain of the ship, when do you know that's not working? And obviously, if you've been in this position for a long time, you probably know. But maybe if you're a new CEO or you're on a staff and you're kind of questioning these things, um, you start to go, well, maybe how do you know like when these things start happening? Well, first and foremost, one of those biggest signs, and I kind of alluded to that thing, is when the meeting starts drifting into tactics. When you start seeing a board start talking into the hows of things, how things get done, looking into the details of, you're getting ready to talk about, the strategic plan, and now all of a sudden we want to get into, well, how does this committee need to design this conference registration material? Okay, well, now we're starting to dig into tactics. That's why we have committees. That's why we have staff. That's why we do those kinds of things. So, anytime you see a board starting to drift into those kinds of things, you know that the board is starting to lose its governance purpose and losing its strategic focus. Another area is, boards desire to want to like help the staff because they feel like they know what they're doing. They've been there before. There's that reason to kind of you start seeing things like that. Another thing is that you see that strategy lives in the retreat binder, not actually in the practice of like doing the work. So, again, when you go through that big process, the board comes in, they spend a lot of money on hiring this amazing strategic planner like myself or Ed or whoever. They come in, they do this great retreat, and the next thing you know, it gets put in this binder and it sits up on a shelf or on a flash drive or on your computer. And what happens? They're not actually putting it into practice. It just gets put away and nobody's actually following the strategy and the step that it works. So, again, that's when you can see that an organization is really losing its purpose. And that's why domain is very important. For anybody who's been in the association industry a long time, many people may know a great consultant and a dear mentor and friend of mine, Bob Harris, which I have to say Bob Harris CAE because I know he would get frustrated if I didn't put the CAE after his name. But Bob Harris told me this a long time ago. He said, Jim, do you know why it is that boards micromanage? And of course, it happens by boards get into this habit where they micromanage things. And I was like, no, I'm curious because I've seen it. I've seen why when boards do micromanage staff or micromanage their CEO. And he said the reason that boards micromanage is because they're bored. They're looking for things to do. So if you don't give boards a direction and a purpose and a strategy, if you're a CEO and you're not challenging them and giving them purpose and focusing them on strategy constantly and giving them direction and where they need to go, most people who are on boards are very type A people. They want to get involved. I don't think most board members do this on purpose. I don't think they do it because they just have this natural inclination to want to get in your way. But if you don't give them a purpose, if you don't give them a strategy, a lot of times it is sometimes the CEO's fault that they boards tend to micromanage because you're not helping them. You're not helping them get that strategy. So again, that's why domain one is around governance, purpose, and strategic focus. So the next domain is around roles